Managing our forests, that's what we're going to talk about today. Okay, this is Jill from the Northwoods, and you might say, I don't really care about how we manage forests, but it's kind of interesting from a hiker point of view. And I decided to dig deep into this because I have seen the forest changes over the years that I've been a hiker, and I wanted to really know what changed. Who changed their minds? What are we supposed to be doing? Are we doing it right even now? Back when I started hiking, when I was grade school, right? I noticed that where I grew up was the last frontier. Maybe Alaska's the last frontier, but maybe my place was the second to last frontier. When we went camping, we just walked into the woods and found a flat spot and camped there instead of going to spot number 3. So it really was a wilderness. And when I camped, pure darkness. Now, it was real woods. If a tree fell in the middle of the hiking path or the flat area, it fell. That's just what it did. And it was just raw forest. It was beautiful. And that's why I think where I grew up, I saw so many wildflowers, even rare ones, like I mentioned with lady slippers. But then I started noticing more towards my high school years that people started tidying up the forest, cleaning it up, removing all the dead branches. If a tree, was a snag and sort of broke off in half and was clearly dead, let's take that down and make our forests nice and clean. It would prevent fires from happening. And that's what we want, right? We want to prevent fires and we want to prevent plant, tree, animal disease. So they just started, and even woods started looking like little parks. And I thought, is this right either? Well, then comes out that was bad. It was bad. Probably, maybe if you're in California, it's a different situation. But here in the Northwoods, in the Midwest, lots of things live in cluttered forest. There are animals, bugs that live in the leaf litter. There are animals and birds and bugs that live in dead trees that have fallen, dead trees that are standing. And the dead trees that are standing are homes to many birds. And as we cut those trees down, you're losing places where owls build nests. You're losing places where woodpeckers look for bugs. Suddenly, we're making a mistake. We are turning something natural into Disney World. And it doesn't have to be that way. So I think we started learning a little bit better about what we needed to do in order to do the right thing. I think now we're really interested in doing the right thing. Not only that, you have also big problems with overforestation. I believe in forestry. I believe wood is a renewable supply, but we have to be smart about it. And after this great fire in 1910 in Montana area, fire suppression became the major policy of most of forestry management. And that was a big part of it. And I understand I don't live in a place with forest fires or very rare forest fires. And so we weren't really taking care of it in the right way. And now what we're doing is we're sort of having a holistic look about how a woods, a forest, even forest inside of a park should look. And they are a source of connected life, from the trees to the soil, the water, the wildlife, the weather that it has. All those things encourage each other. We're running into problems now where one of my favorite places to go birding got turned into essentially a dog park. And a lot of birds nest on the ground. A lot of birds nest in shrubs. And then when you have big, lunky dogs who aren't going to be mean or anything like that, the birds don't know that. And you may scare a bird away from its nest and it may never come back. And so as trees were cut down, as natural areas are turned into pedestrian areas, suddenly we're losing more and more places. This place that I go birding at used to be the big spot for birds. Hundreds of birds we saw there. Saw some this year. I mean, it was nice that it kind of seems like it started coming back a bit. What happened is they have a conservation board, but they just turned the whole thing into a paved path. That was years of construction and banging noises and all the things that go with that. And there's so many bikers and so many runners and so many people with dogs there and so many people talking loudly. It's right by a school. And so a bunch of kids are talking really loudly, scaring everything away. And, you have to sort of think about it in terms of these balances. Some places for all of that, and some places that we keep more natural, more quiet, and more available to wildlife. And I think we can find that balance. I don't believe that nature is more important than human beings, but I also believe that we have the capability of finding a balance between it. Another park that was in my area, big birding place. It used to be my secret place to go. I'd never see another human being there. And back when I started running and I was really embarrassed, I would go trail running back into the woods because it was very quiet. I didn't disturb a lot of birds because the birds were in the other part of the park. And now everyone's there. And the Boy Scouts are there. And all these big events are there. And now, again, they're turning it into a dog park. Essentially, they're opening up the area that had a lot of prairie birds and turned it into a place where dogs can run around. That's the end. You can't have dogs running where there are bird nests. And again, I'm not saying that we can't balance it out, right? There should be dog parks. There should be biking parks. There should be running areas. And then there should be places that we leave for birds. And unfortunately, a lot of the places where we leave for birds are becoming more and more rare, which is causing a huge swath of types of birds to become rare because they don't have breeding places anymore. And like I said, I think in the past couple of years, we've gotten smarter about it so that we know, hey, this is a really special spot. Let's just leave this little area, for breeding birds. Let's leave this area for water birds, and we'll figure it out. So I believe that we're sort of finding a balance in many of the cases. I don't know that the cities around me are doing that very well. But again, we're trying to find that kind of, balance. And, think about preventing forest fires. Let's talk about that as an issue. California has its own set of issues. And like I said, I'm not going to debate Western wildfires because I don't know as much about it as I knew about what's going on in the Midwest. But fires are necessary parts of forests too, because what they do is there are certain types of seeds that only pop out on forest fires. That heat causes them to expand and pop out. Some pine trees in my area are like that. And so they need fires. And so now what we're starting to see, and I'm starting to see when I go hiking, are controlled burns because we understand now the importance of burning to prevent invasive species, to prevent disease from forming, to remove trees from areas that should be prairies. And you say, well, shouldn't you just let it go and do what it's going to do? As we talked about in a podcast ages ago, I should do it again for YouTube. There is basically this progression when it comes to land, that the edge of forests have prairies, and then the prairies start growing trees, and then they become part of the forest. But at some point you might say, well, we really want a balance here. That place that I said is being turned into a dog park has one of the most amazing prairies around for nesting birds, things like eastern meadowlarks, bobolinks, field birds that don't have a lot of places to go because many of the fields around here are plowed. And so portioning off an area of that and keeping the trees out is, while not natural, it is preventing the complete removal of this area. Just to give you an idea, so I'm in the Midwest. There, in my neck of the woods, were not trees. Essentially, this entire southern part of the state was all prairie. It was all prairie. And what they did is they offered money to, let's say you're going to settle the land. You have to plow and produce this much agriculture, and then you could keep the land. It was an offer to settlers. But you could also plant X many trees. And so many of the trees that we have in my area are not from here originally. No, that's not necessarily bad. I mean, maple trees are a part of that. There's a lot of things that were never part of here. I'm not saying that the only things we should have are indigenous. Earthworms here, not indigenous, but we have them and they are very useful to the land. So not saying we should get rid of everything, but sort of having, like I said, a balanced view of it. And now we look for places where we can prioritize tree clearing. Maybe the trees in this particular area are too fragile. Maybe they're too much of what they call a monoculture. Maybe the maples started taking over and there used to be pine trees in there. So we're going to mix it up a little bit. And that, because there's a diversity there, will offer a more resilient forest. And now we know a lot more, too, about what makes a healthy soil, what kind of forest degradation helps to produce good land for basically the continuation of the forest. And I don't believe that you have to keep things the way they were back in whatever year you decide you have to keep it. But now we're getting better about it. And like I said, we are getting a lot smarter about what we do. And we're also now looking, too, to our watersheds. When we pollute the watersheds with farming runoff, now we're able to do a better job of making sure that runoff doesn't get into the watershed, because that watershed is also feeding my city, that kind of thing. So I think we're learning kind of the interconnectedness of it and how to better take care of everything. And the idea of how can we better manage the forest? Like I said, at one point it was just leaving the forest be. And then at some point they decided to start cleaning the woods, and now we're leaving it messy on purpose. Our understanding of it has evolved quite a bit. And in fact, these tree snags are so important these days, they're almost called a keystone structure, meaning that standing dead wood, like I said, owls, squirrels, woodpeckers, bees. I found a tree. I have a picture of it. If I can find it, I'll put it up here, where this old snag has these really tiny pinholes in them all over this tree. Like, what is that, right? And so I look and I found out that that's where a number of species of bees, carpenter bees, drill into the wood and build homes in there. They do that in dead trees. There's about 1,000 species in North America alone that lives in decaying wood, and some only live there. So rotting trees, big part of it. And keeping the messy carpet of the tree, it's great. Like I said, beetles, centipedes, springtails, if you know what those are, earthworms, love it. And then those bugs feed the birds, the frogs, the small mammals. There's fungi, bacteria, little tiny plants that you have to look at. I mean, they are they look like little trees the size of your pinky finger. And all of that adds to the soil back into the system. And even we talked about the spring ephemerals. Some of them, like lady slippers and trillium, depend on that leaf litter and the right kinds of fungus, soil conditions to grow in those areas, which is, like I said, my theory about why I saw so many of them when I was a kid. Among down branches, we also find salamanders. We did a podcast about that. Frogs, toads, slugs, and snails, all sorts of things. But like I said, what we got wrong in the past was partially cleaning the forest, partially removing all the debris. Sometimes, like I said, it was done because we're trying to prevent forest fires or disease, from going and drying out and then causing forest fires. But honestly, there are layered, messy forest fire. But now we're starting to understand that a layered, messy forest are more resilient to catastrophic wildfires than cleaning up the forest. Because when you clean up the forest, it just jumps from tree to tree to tree instead of getting suppressed here and there. Now, if it's all dead wood and it's just, and maybe you're in California, like I said, California is its whole other a situation. They have their own kind of forestry management than what we would have here in the Midwest. But the messy forest can actually prevent forest fires. And not only that, this periodic burning I mentioned before also can help forest fires, essentially getting rid of some of the more dead material that burns right up. So if you ever see an area where they did a controlled burn, you'll see all this blackened soil where everything is burned down to the soil. But you'll notice that on the healthy trees, it kind of goes up a few inches on the healthy trees. There's enough water inside of the trees. It's protected. But on some of the very small dead trees, they burn down. And on the very big snags, they're so big they don't burn. So it kind of does the best of all worlds when doing these controlled burns. And this year, when I went on my vacation, I would say about half the places I went, I could see evidence of a recent controlled burn. The amazing thing about it is that place I told you about that was being turned into a dog park. They do a controlled burn there almost every year. And what's amazing is you go out there probably March and April, and it's all burned down to the ground. You go out there in May, and it's up to here. I did a recording, which I put in my podcast about bees. I did that recording there because by the time I came back later in the summer, it was as tall as I was, and there were wildflowers everywhere. So it comes back from preventative burning very easily. And then the other part of it, too, is that they're starting to get the idea not to suppress all fires. Again, not in California, but around here. Let it burn for a little bit, keep it under control, let's watch it and make sure. And it's probably doing some good in that forest. It's encouraging that natural cycle of cleaning up some of the deader wood, but also then getting those seeds that need fire to restore themselves. So it's part of it. I mean, we have seen fires that start in the middle of nowhere, evidence of it, in the middle, before you had American settlers here, that burned the whole entire areas of places. It was a natural part of woods. Now we live places. We don't want those fires burning down our houses or injuring people, that kind of thing. So now we are more careful about it, but we have to know some places we let it go and some places we have to stop it right away. One of the problems when I was reading some articles about forest management is that as they were tidying up the forest, it ended up making the trees more dense. So more trees would find places to grow because the forest was all tidied up and clean. And the forest got more and more crowded with trees. And as they got more and more crowded, it became what they called a perfect storm for mega fires instead of having this mixed bag of things that were there. And so what do we know about controlled burns is that, first of all, they will pick on the thin, dry fuel. Like I said, these small saplings, these very tiny dead branches that won't provide a home to any owl because it's too small, and little tiny snags. They walk around and they stop the fire from laddering, going up the trees and the canopy, which could be catastrophe if you did it in some areas. They monitor that. They focus on areas where they're trying to thin it out as compared to a place where they're trying to wipe everything else out. We noticed that in the marsh I went to last week, there was a controlled burn in the bog itself. And we're wondering, how did they get back there? I imagine it's probably not as deep as I think it is. I probably imagine that they went back there with waders and flamethrowers and did it that way. And they look for good messes versus bad messes. A good mess is rotting thick logs, leaf litter, large tree snags. Leave those alone. Bad messes are dense underbrush, invasive species, piles of dry matter that's not producing life, right? That's what they're going to thin out and they're going to burn. There's also areas around towns, roads, and defensible spaces that they're very careful that they try to clean up the brush within like 30 to 100 feet, remove low branches, and create a buffer zone that is there to prevent any fires, not just controlled burns, but anything from jumping from a controlled burn to a real neighborhood. I've seen that too. I watch the homesteader shows, and they will do that for homesteaders too that live in fire areas. Low branches, thin trees, nearby trees, and clearing out all the firewood material that's away from the house. So either way, they kind of protect it. There was kind of an interesting story, just to kind of clean this up, is that back they were talking about kind of the fires in California. And again, I'm not an expert on that, but why some of those fires stopped at the state border. And so I started doing research. What's the difference between Canada and the U.S.? And part of it is that Canada does a lot more active forestry, especially when you're close to populated areas. They are thinning down the forest. They do controlled burns more often. The logging leaves fewer areas where it can ladder up to the tops of trees, preventing basically fires from jumping to the tops of trees that are remaining there. And the part of it too is that a lot of our land has thicker underbrush from years of not doing controlled burns. And so they run into environmental red tape, state law. I know a lot of time carbon in the air has stopped controlled burns. They didn't want to put carbon in the air, so they didn't do the controlled burns. And then you got a lot of litter, dead litter that's no good to any plant or bug or bird just on the ground. And so they would stop doing anything in that area, and they stopped managing the forest at all. Canada has a very long tradition of prescribed burns, and they also tolerate smaller fires and try to manage it. Basically, after the 1910 Montana fire, we moved to total fire suppression, which was a land policy that was causing problems. The other part of the problem is that in the United States, and I like this about the United States, is we're patchwork, right? Some areas are owned by state, local, federal, private. There's all sorts of land owned by different areas. And so having a continuous kind of policy makes it harder to do, while Canada doesn't have as much of a patchwork as we do. They have forest zones that they control at the federal level, and so they're able to do these fire burns. I am not advocating for that, but just as a solution that we have to find when it comes to various people owning various pieces of land. Essentially, at that particular point right now, Canada does a better job, I think, of forest management when it comes to fire than the United States will do in every location. So I think that's sometimes why you see some of that happening. And it's unfortunate because this desire to keep away from putting carbon in the air causes these giant forest fires that put a ton of carbon in the air. And that's another place where we can find balance, where we say this amount of burning will save us a much more amount of burning later on. That's the idea. So I think we're learning more. Like I said, I think that all our science and understanding the rhythms of nature, understanding what needs what's the best way to go. I think we're going to get there. I think we're going to get this idea of what it is we should be saving, what it is we should be letting grow, where should we do it, how can we control it so that we can contain these gigantic fires. So I think it's important. The giant sequoias need fires for their pine cones. Longleaf pine also thrives where fire is occurring. So like I said, I hope we're finding a balance between it all. I think it's good because it controls pests, it boosts native species, it removes the risk of other fires by leaving dry fuel around, and it returns nutrients to the soil. Forest management has that ability to really kind of make everything a little bit better. Someday we'll talk about marsh preservation. There is something that my local marsh does that is amazing, and we'll have to do a whole podcast about that. All right, everyone, thanks so much. I appreciate you watching. My challenge to you is, well, don't go out and burn anything. My challenge to you is just read up about the forest management in your neck of the woods. Again, it's going to be a little bit different for me. I live in a wet area, a forested area, but your policies in your local area might be a little bit different. Thanks so much. I appreciate you watching. Please remember that you can comment in the channel. Email me at jill@startwithsmallsteps.com. Thanks so much.